I'd like to begin this morning by saying to all those who have served our country, the families of those who have served, thanks for your service. For all my Vietnam brothers, I'd like to say welcome home, and I appreciate the sacrifice and service that you have given this country as well. If you'd like to get your Bibles and open to the book of Job, in chapter 1 at verse 1, the writer begins, "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. There was a man whose name was Job." When James wrote to his epistles addressing the practical Christian living, he closes with an appeal for patience. In chapter 5 at verse 7, he says, "Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and later rain. You also be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand." Then in verse 10, "My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job, and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful." Notice who James points to here as an example of patience. That man named Job. In fact, Job's name is synonymous with patience. We know the old saying, "As patient as Job," or "He has the patience of Job." But Job's name is associated with more than just patience. Victor Hugo once declared, "Tomorrow, if all the literature was to be destroyed, and it was left to me to retain one book only, I would save Job." Tennyson called the book of Job the greatest poem, whether of ancient or modern literature. Daniel Webster said, "The book of Job, taken as mere work of literary genius, is one of the most wonderful productions of any age, of any language." Wow. Inspired instructions regarding patience and a hallmark creation of literature. It is a little sad, though, that these men saw only the literary preeminence of the book. You would hope to think that they at least gained some spiritual edification as well. If you're reading through the Bible this year, many said they were, and everyone should be, Job is one of those books that's a bit challenging to read. It's written in Oriental poetry construction, and the story of Job and his friends is embedded in this work of poetry. Many are intimidated by long books in the Old Testament. Job is one of those 42 chapters. Names are hard to pronounce, figurative language that can be confusing, but it's worth our time and effort because there's not one person that doesn't need some of the lessons that are found in that wonderful book. Now, I'm not going to preach all the way through Job this morning. It would take longer than some of you might want to stay. But I want to look at some of the main characters of the book and see if there's some lessons for us, some encouragement and edification to face and overcome the world we live in with all its challenges, trials, and temptation. And let's begin with the villain, not only of this story, but of all mankind, and that is, of course, Satan. In Job chapter 1, beginning at verse 8, the writer says, "Then the Lord said to Satan, Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, around it all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands and his possessions, and have increased in the land. But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." God reveals to us in this story a lot about who Satan actually is. And I think the first lesson that we surely need to learn is that he's real. He's not a figment of man's imagination. He's not a mythical figure that's created to scare people into following a particular religion, but he is a real spiritual being. And we see his true character revealed to us in this story as well. a character that is revealed to us over and over again throughout the scriptures. We see what his true interests are. We see how he views mankind, and we learn how little regard he has for God's creation. Here's a glimpse of Satan's basic view of mankind, and that is people believe in God and serve him only when they are prospering. Basically, no man or woman really serves God simply because they love him. He sees no one with a pure motive. He thinks everyone is a hypocrite, and everyone is playing an angle with selfish motivation driving their actions. Basically, Satan has a low regard for mankind, those created in the image of God. And he always about the business of opposing man before God. In Zechariah chapter 3 at verse 1, then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to oppose him. And Jesus even said about Simon in Luke 22 and verse 31, Simon, Simon, indeed Satan asked for you that he may sift you as wheat. We get a good look at Satan's view of human suffering as well. And to Satan, suffering is only a tool to get man to renounce God. He has a complete absence of compassion, which tells us that there's no love in Satan except maybe for himself. The more I consider Satan's evaluation of Job, the less I see it as an evaluation of Job as much as a revelation of Satan's true nature. Satan sees everyone as a manipulator and a fair-weather friend. Satan gives nothing, offers nothing for free, and always expects something for himself. Now, Satan's conclusions of man may very well prove correct in the lives of some people, but he missed the mark in regards to Job. And we learn from this that Satan is neither all-powerful or all-knowing. What we have to guard against is having the same cynical view of others that the devil has. Are we suspicious of others? Do we constantly question people's motives? Do we consider people as manipulators and hypocrites? We have to be careful that we don't use the devil as our example rather than Jesus. We should consider the good in others, give others the benefit of the doubt. Prove our enemy wrong by not doing only what is right, but doing right for all the right reasons. You see, every time we have a judgmental thought, or a thought of envy, or a thought of jealousy or hate, we're in fact being demonic, which is the very opposite of being Christ-like. Let's take a moment to consider Job's wife. In chapter 2 at verse 9, it says, Then his wife said to him, Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. This is what we will forever remember this woman for. But to be fair, I think that we should remember that Job's wife suffered as well. Except for the boils from head to toe, every loss Job suffered, she suffered. And I'm sure that the most painful loss was the loss of her children. And after all, that's now that she's married to a man, she has to watch to suffer in misery day and night. You have to ask yourself, just why was she saved when Satan took everything else that Job had away from him? It may have been that that Satan felt that she would be a greater discouragement to him alive than dead. You remember he used Eve to get Adam to sin. Why not Job's wife to get Job to sin? When we think about her statement to Job, it shows us that she believed that suffering gives one the right to be angry at God and angry at life. Suffering gives one the right to opt out by ending one's life. That there's no benefit in suffering, so why remain around for the lesson? And she seems to resent the fact that Job didn't sympathize with her or mourn in the same way that she did. Job's wife is like so many people. She was short-sighted to blindness. Think about it. What would be the use of cursing God and dying and then meeting up with God after this life is over? What a horrible way to introduce ourselves to God by cursing him in life. Shake your fist at God in anger, and then having to kneel before him wishing for mercy. She also teaches us a lesson in selfishness. When she wanted Job to curse God and die, exactly what was left for her? Well, for one thing, she's not going to be burdened with taking care of a man whose whole existence was misery and pain. Far too many people in the world have the same kind of attitude towards their seasoned family members. They don't want to be burdened with any kind of care. They too, sometimes wish that they would just die, or better yet, stick them away somewhere and forget about them. One writer said this: if we ever find ourselves in this taxing situation, may God grant us the realization of the blessings He has in store for us when we are involved in and are being entrusted with the care of another precious human being. Well, let's think about briefly Job's three friends, Larry, Curly, and Moe. No, that's not right. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. You might think about Larry, Curly, and Moe after you read their words of encouragement for their friend. We do have to give credit to where credit is due, though. It seems that everyone had forsaken Job because of his suffering and poverty. In chapter 19 at verse 17, Job says, "My breath is offensive to my wife, and I am repulsive to the children of my own body. Even young children despise me. I arise, and they speak against me. All my close friends abhor me, and those whom I have loved turned against me." Now these men had not. They showed up, and the first comfort they offered was silence. In chapter 2 at verse 11, now when Job's three friends, heard of his adversity that had come upon him, each came from his own place: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite, for they had made an appointment together to come and mourn with him and to comfort him. And when they raised their eyes from afar and did not recognize him, they lifted their voices and wept. And each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head towards heaven. So they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. There's a lot to be said about just being there and silently sharing what someone is having to endure. There are a lot of folks who gain more comfort by our presence than by our words. And the truth is, so many of us simply do not know the right words to say, and sometimes there are no right words. And so it is when Job's three friends opened their mouths, what they said were not words of comfort, but accusatory words. They might have thought that they were doing good, but at the end they learned that they were terribly wrong, because what they said expressed their view of the cause of people's suffering, which was terribly wrong. Eliphaz said in chapter 4, beginning at verse 7, "Remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright ever cut off? Even as I have been, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." Bildad said in chapter 8 at verse 6, "If you were pure and upright, surely now he would awake for you and prosper your rightful dwelling place." And then Zophar said in chapter 11 at verse 13, "If you would prepare your heart and stretch out your hands toward him, if iniquity were in your hands and you put it far away, and you would not let wickedness dwell in your tents, then surely you could lift up your face without spot. Yes, you could be steadfast and not fear." You see, their basic view of suffering was that suffering is always a specific punishment for sin. And even though Job had been faithful to the Lord in the past, in their view, he must have done something very wrong to deserve all of these misfortunes. In chapter 4 at verse 3, "Your words have upheld him who is stumbling, and you have strengthened the feeble knees. But now it comes upon you, and you are weary. It touches you, and you are troubled." You see, in their opinions, the righteous are always rewarded physically, and the wicked are always punished physically in this life. This way of thinking has been around for eons and ages. Centuries after Job, Jesus would condemn this attitude in the story of the man born blind in John chapter 9. You see, the disciples of Jesus felt the same way that Job's friends felt. In John chapter 9 at verse 1, now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, said, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. And even the religious leaders felt that way. And as they said to the man that Jesus had healed in chapter 9 at verse 34, and they answered and said to him, you're completely born in sin, and you're teaching us, and they cast him out. And if you're not careful, we too can begin to think that way as well. The car won't start this morning. God must be punishing me for something. My life is comfortable. God must be pleased with me. That person has a good job, a nice home, a beautiful family. He must be saved. Or more dangerous than that, that religious group is big and growing. God must be blessing them. Truly, the story of Job teaches us that bad things happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people. The external conditions of life are not a spiritual barometer. Of course, then we have the young man Elihu. Even though he is described as being young, he shows more wisdom than his older companions. He realizes that their conclusions were incorrect in chapter 32 at verse 12. He says, I paid close attention to you, and surely not one of you convinced Job or has answered his words. He did, in fact, understand that God can use pain to get a person's attention and bring them closer to him. Pain can be used to refine and teach. In chapter 33 at verse 16, then he opens the ears of men and seals their instructions in order to turn man from his deeds and conceal pride from man. He keeps back his soul from the pit and his life from perishing by the sword. Man is also chastened with pain on his bed and with strong pain in many of his bones. And again, here's a truth that is taught throughout the scriptures. In Romans 5 at verse 3, Paul wrote, and not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. Now hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who has given us. In Psalms 119 at verse 71, David said, it is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I may learn your statutes. Paul learned this lesson himself in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 at verse 7. And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing I pled with the Lord 3 times, that it might be depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I would rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ might rest upon me. C.S. Lewis was correct when he wrote, pain is God's megaphone. And finally, we have the main character, Job. And what can we say about Job that doesn't take 42 chapters to tell? To begin with, let's go back to the New Testament. In James chapter 1 at verse 2, James says, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. And then 1 Peter chapter 1 at verse 6, Peter says, in this you greatly rejoice, though for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials. When we think about the trials of life, quite often we want to categorize every challenge that we face in life as being the kind of trials spoken of by James and Peter or found in the story of Job. But the reality is that many of our trials are simply bumps in the road of life and have little impact on a person's life or outlook. The preacher tells us that there will be days of prosperity in which we shall rejoice, and there will be days of adversity in which we should consider that God has made both so that we will not know what will happen after us. You see, every day's bumps are not the kinds of things that the Bible usually speaks of, when trials are mentioned. Job reveals to us some characteristics of real trial. Think about these few descriptions, if you will. A real trial is one that rocks your world. Our mind has difficulty grasping what is happening because it seems unimaginable. It's like that we've been kicked in the stomach and the pain doesn't subside, it only increases. A real trial, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. You can't see how the trial will end, whether good or bad. The solution is invisible. Nothing seems to help. Real trials go on for extended periods of time, and because of that are constantly beating us down until it seems as if we can't go on. From God's point of view, if a trial is going to have its greatest benefit, it must bring us to the point of complete helplessness. As long as we believe that we can solve the problem, that we can find a solution, or that we can weather the storm on our own, we have not learned the most important lessons. Trials and sufferings are only helpful when we turn to God for understanding, endurance, and deliverance. When we seek Bible wisdom for guidance and strength. When we are ready to learn from a trustworthy God. And when we realize that Jesus can sympathize with us, whatever our trial might be. And when we're sensitized to the sufferings of others. You see, Job's resolve was seen in the early part of his trial. In chapter 2 at verse 10, in all this Job did not sin with his lips. But then at the end, we see the growth that Job acquired. In chapter 42, beginning at verse 1. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You ask, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Listen, please, and let me speak. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. I have heard you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. Therefore I abhor myself, and repent in dust and ashes. The realizations of God's omnipotent and omniscient being, and Job's unworthiness were the great lessons that he learned. What do we learn from Job? Well, there's many lessons, but consider that sometimes we don't know why God allows us to suffer. But when challenges or trials come, the only way that we suffer through is by putting our trust completely and wholly in God, and knowing whatever it is, we can gain something from it. May the God of heaven bless us as we live from day to day.